Alrighty, so hi everybody. I'm just going to tell you a little bit about who completed this data collection wave, and just to give you an idea of, as Susan has alluded to, the things you need to consider when analysing this data collection. So as Susan has mentioned, this was an electronic data collection wave, and what that meant is that participants were sent a link to complete a questionnaire. So we used a tool called Survey Gizmo. Should know that, shouldn't I? And so what we found is that although parents had told us they were very keen to use this method of data collection, they needed some prompting to get it done. So what we found is they needed reminders or incentives to complete the data collection wave. We also had a proportion of parents who were unable to complete electronically, and we provided other options for them, such as a telephone call or an actual face-to-face interview. So although the electronic mode was our primary method of delivery for this data collection wave, we did end up supplementing that somewhat. As Susan has mentioned, this is a mother-completed data collection wave. And that's again important to consider, especially if you're asking a question that is longitudinal in nature. So generally when we're using our data sets, or even when we report on our data collection waves, it's very child-centric or child-focused. And as Susan mentioned, we have 6,853 children, so that will be your denominator. However, in this case, we're looking at just the mothers. And because we have multiple births, you need to take that into consideration, and Avanesh will also cover that in a little more detail for you. So just to give you an idea about when this data collection wave happened, which is often an important thing when you're trying to relate it to the time that people answered these questions, not just in relation to their child's age, but in relation to what is happening in New Zealand at the time. This data collection wave was completed between 2015 and 2016. And it is really about the experiences of the cohort children when they started school. So that is really the primary focus. We have some other questions in this data collection wave. We have some questions around the before school check. We've asked about their household, but primarily this is really about starting school. Okay, so one of the really, I guess, the key strengths of growing up in New Zealand is that the cohort is generalisable to the New Zealand child population. And of course this is really important when we consider informing policy development. And it has to be, policy development needs to be relevant to the population. And so it's important for us to understand that our cohort achieves that. And it does, which is wonderful. And as Susan mentioned, please go and read those core papers. So the Generalizability paper is an excellent read, as well as all the retention cohort establishment papers. They're a really good base to help you understand more about the cohort. And it's a pretty complex beast, this longitudinal study. So I think those core papers are really useful to start at. So that's my advice to you. Okay, so when we look at cohort retention or completion, so what I mean by this is who participated in data collection waves. So you can see here, we've got our antenatal data collection wave where we have 100% of our participants completing. And from there, we see in our 9-month, 2-year, and 54-month, we have pretty much 90% of our participants have completed these data collection waves, which is fantastic, right? So that's a really good retention rate. And internationally, it's outstanding. And then when we come to 72-month, we see that it's dropped a little. So it's around 84% at the 72-month data collection wave. Now, internationally, again, that's fantastic. But, you know, we're used to 90%. So for us, it's really important to understand why that happened. But from another point of view, it's also important to understand who are these 16% of participants who haven't participated in this data collection wave. So I'm just going to cover really briefly. So this covers, this you can follow along in the report if you have it, but just the significant results in terms of socio-demographic factors that were associated with participation. So if we look at age, so this is maternal age at pregnancy. You can see on the left, so nearest the y-axis here, we have mothers who were under 20 years of age, when they were pregnant, and moving along to older mothers. So for that young mother group, we can see that the participation rate was only a little over 60%. So you've already got quite a big difference between young mums and older mums in terms of completing this data collection wave. And this is not something that we've seen previously because we've had such high participation rates across our preschool period. So I think it's an important thing to note if you're going to be using antenatal age group in your analysis. If you look towards our older mothers, you can see that it's pretty much 90% of mothers that are over 30 have completed this data collection wave. So another important aspect of our study is ethnicity, and that diversity is really important to us, not only because we want to capture all our children's voices, but because we want it to be representative of the New Zealand population. So what you can see in this graph here is that although we have over 90% of our European mums completing this data collection wave, it's much lower for our other ethnic groups. And in particular, you can see that for Pacifica mothers, less than 70% are completing this data collection wave. So that's a really important consideration when you're analysing this data. Another significant finding was education. So we found that mothers who did not have any secondary school qualifications, there was a lower proportion of these mums completing this data collection wave. We then have our mothers who have a bachelor's degree or higher, showing very high participation rates in this data collection wave. So again, just bearing in mind that skew of the data that we're seeing in this particular data collection wave. Lastly, we looked at area level deprivation, and this again was significant in terms of those who participated and those who did not. So we had over 90% of mothers who were in the low or medium area level deprivation participating. However, this was lower when we look at our high deprivation groups. So just to summarise the 72-month data collection wave in terms of who has participated, it's important to note that bias, and if you are thinking about doing a longitudinal analysis, you need to be careful about what that means for your analysis if you're looking at a particular population group. Because we have such diversity in our cohort, you probably still have power to look at those groups, but it's just something that you need to consider when you're looking at the proportion of mothers who are potentially having a positive outlook or a negative outlook, who they actually are representing. And do remember that this is a mother report of their experience of their child starting school. So that's their experience of what they think, how it went for them. And then secondly, we're asking the mothers to report on their child's experience. So that's their perception of their child's experience. So which can be a tricky one to write in a report, but just bear in mind that this isn't necessarily how the child experienced their transition to school, but it was the perception of the mother. And with that, I'll hand you over to Peter.